The question of whether some people are NPCs, non-player characters, has been getting kicked around a lot lately. In my experience, it's not a binary proposition, but rather that there are gradations of this. Some would speculate that it's a discrete function, like a 0 or a 1. You are an NPC or you are not. You have a soul or you don't. But I think it's more of a continuous function than a discrete one. So what is the soul? How could someone lack a soul? In many traditions, the most tangible aspect of the soul is the ethereal body. It exists in everyone, but its condition varies between individuals. The ethereal body is withered and small in the NPC, constricted, surrounded by emotionally laden parasitic thought forms, sucking the life out of it like a Dyson sphere surrounding a star, darkening and deadening the outward expression, diminishing its vibration from that of love that is in the child, limiting it only to those whose ideas and or form align or match respectively. It's an insular and provincial arrangement of thoughts, like the blind on a window that opens up to shine its love only on the familiar. It is clannish, it is tribal, it is political. When people talk about NPCs, they're only talking about adults. NPCs are manufactured from children who don't start that way. The child comes into this world in a particular circumstance. The experiences from which build the mind that eventually constricts the soul to some extent, depending on the weight of this karma and the identification with it. So NPC status is fractional, more like a curve than a bar chart, and the y-axis or dependent variable would be consciousness, and the x-axis would be the percent of ongoing attention given to mental content versus the moment, multiplied by the strength of identification with the physical and conceptual subject of those thoughts, of that content. So it's the volume of content times the strength of identification with its subject, which yields the inverse of spaciousness. The more of that attention given to such ideas, the less spaciousness there is, and thus the less consciousness, and thus the less empathy. And this makes one more an NPC, because NPCs in video games are programmed, and the more unconscious a person is, the more they are operating from conditioning, from programming. So you can have people who are quite dynamic and have a vast range of emotional expressions who are actually NPCs. It's not that they are just unthinking shells, but actually that it's too much thinking, too much emotional response, too much saturation that makes them NPCs. It puts them on rails of conditioning that they must follow. Their emotional reactions are quite predictable. NPCs are programmed, but make no mistake, they feel their emotions very strongly. I mean, emotions are survival mechanisms. They exist within animals too. It draws forth the energy to meet whatever circumstance arises. So it's evolved into us. It's just that these emotions are always a function of circumstance in the NPC. In the NPC, there's a baseline state of being that's the product of the average vibration of their mental content, which is determined by how well circumstance accommodates it. So the vibration goes up and down depending on how close reality matches the mind's ideal. But for the player character, the one who is not an NPC, they actually know it's all a game, and thus they're not identified with the character, and as such they don't react in the same way. They're not affected in the energy body. They don't have their vibrational level modulated as much by what appears, and as such their ethereal body is unbound by the seriousness caused by belief in being the body and mind. And in this unencumbered spaciousness, the baseline state is love. It's our natural state. A love that doesn't rely on anything to make it appear. It's just allowed by default. So in the player character, they don't need the fingerprint of identity to match up in others in order to radiate love. In extreme cases, like that of Ramana Maharshi, They know that there are no others. They don't perceive others as other. So it's the weight of karma that determines the degree to which the NPC is unconscious. Children start with open hearts that get closed off based on their conditioning, which is the product of the time and place into which they were born, which in the wheel of samsara is a function of the vibrational level of the jiva. In the transmigration of souls, of energy bodies, it's born to parents whose average vibrational level matches this. The journey from NPC to player character is the same as the journey from the uninstructed but open-hearted child to the uninstructed and closed-hearted adult, back to the open-hearted adult child who has the benefit of life experience and the experience of going from conscious to unconscious and then back to conscious. There's an amnesia of states between the conscious child and the unconscious adult that is only realized when the adult becomes conscious again through this process of surrender and letting go that ultimately destroys unconscious body and mind identification. All this means that the percentage of the population that is NPC can vary between eras, as is suggested by the theory of yugas, different time periods in which the average level of consciousness is more or less depending on Earth's proximity to some conscious giving center of the universe. Given that our technology has advanced in its ability to make impressions in consciousness through media, and that the availability of both spiritually enlightening and spiritually deadening information is more abundant, there's the possibility of an extreme bimodal distribution of consciousness within the population. Like there's greater opportunity for people to overcome their unconscious identification with form through spiritual teachings that were once very hidden, but there's also greater opportunity to have an insular identity cultivated within oneself through media that tells you you are this or you are that and that you've got to defend this. We live in an age of strong identitarianism, strong identification with superficial things like race, nation, gender, political affiliation, sports ball team, whatever, you name it. And at the same time, you have access to all the spiritual teachings of the ages. Like I've talked about 30 years ago, how when I was a teenager, a young man, I lived with a man in his 50s, a guy named Frank, who, before the internet was mainstream, was talking to me about things like pranayama and Hermes Trismegistus and the Kabbalion and all these other esoteric teachings. And back then, to find that information, you'd have had to look hard in the library or find practitioners in other parts of the world. But now, all that information is at your fingertips. But so is the NPC-making world of identitarianism, of opinion. So the NPC-making machine is very much with us today, but the opportunity to escape it is also with us. The NPC is trapped in duality, a worshipping of the idol of self. So the dualistic entity worshippers and various types of materialists are all locked in this paradigm of duality, making them more or less NPCs, suffering the illusion of separation. They remain as such unless something destroys their body identification, but it has to be in just the right way so as to not leave them as useless sufferers of dissociation. This is the danger of seeking the exit from relative reality to discover the absolute reality. So given that your attention is a zero-sum game, and that what you observe is given a status in reality by virtue of being observed, the perpetual unconscious ignoring of the truth of this moment that feeds the energy body, in favor instead of content that in the ignorance of body identification consumes it, or the ignorance that is body identification consumes it. It yields the anemia, the anemic soul that causes this hunger that's of unknown origin, that drives the NPC to keep chasing, to keep fighting, to keep defending. A real player in a real game, pursuing that to which the mind points. And this is desire. This is suffering. So the inner arrangement of the NPC has them giving attention to thought forms born of conditioning, And in this continuous function, as we move closer to the full bandwidth of attention being given to conditioning, to impressions in consciousness born of experience, the less perception there is of that which we call a soul, and the less nourishing of it there is. The more the soul is parasitized, and the energy that follows attention is given over to thought forms. It's like the observer effect. Those thought forms are given a place in existence by virtue of the attention they are given. And so the NPC is a programmed being. Attention is given to that programming, and then the expression of consciousness moves closer to that saturation point. In that 1 and 0 paradigm, it brings them closer to that 1. Or that 0, I guess, if you say they don't have a soul. So NPCs are fractional NPCs, but they move closer to being a whole NPC. It's just a function of the weight of the programming and the extent to which it's identified with. It becomes the being, and that's evidenced in the reactions to contradiction. The more identified somebody is with the conditioning that's been implanted, the greater the share of attention that conditioning gets. The more identification there is with it, the greater the reaction. So they'll react more to contradiction. The NPC-like person is going to react the hardest to ideas that challenge their worldview. The more territorial they'll be, because the scope of what they consider self takes up more room. They have more opinions. They have more triggers. And so as they're exposed to more content, there's more things that could potentially countervail them. They need more space because of this. They need to be around people who agree with them all the time. So the NPC is an easily offended being. So like NPC-like behavior, for example, people on the road, they're the ones that, they're going to hate you just for existing where you exist if it inconveniences them. They have no empathy because their bandwidth of attention is not open. There's something about spaciousness that cannot be communicated adequately to somebody who lacks experience with it. What it means, the importance of it as it relates to empathy. So when attention is given to the present as opposed to the conditioning, there's a receptiveness. The lack of identification with anything in particular gives a greater opportunity for overlap in terms of perceiving the humanity of others. There's less overlap in people who are subject to very particularized conditioning. The fingerprint of identity has to match. So if there's overlap between you and me in terms of our conditioning, if we're both NPCs, it's an overlap of programming which allows us to be open and loving to one another. But if my particular programming doesn't match your particular programming, there's potential for a clash. But in having spaciousness, our energy is unencumbered, and spaciousness overlaps spaciousness, absolutely. If I have no identification with conditioning, and you don't either, it's like the fingerprints of identity have been filed off, and our identities are the same in that we both perceive that we are not but the awareness. There's something in that state, again, that can't be communicated to the NPC because they can't experience it. They're within the amnesia of states that follows when the child gets constricted. The awareness of the child gets constricted, hemmed into conditioning. But without that appears the natural state. And in the natural state is love. That's not a function of anything. It's a palpable, non-relational, persistent love that just is. I've been told that God knows our hearts better than we do, which means there's 100% overlap between what is perceived through you and what is perceived by the universe through you. Like that perspective is one and the same. Those perspectives, there's 100% overlap. In order for divinity to know you better than you know, that divinity would also have to have the ability to share your perspective totally. And so to the extent that being observed impacts the state of matter, what we are giving life to by virtue of our attention in the NPC is dead. It's of the past. It's just forms in consciousness. Ideas are being given life through attention, and what's lost in that is the life that's given to the ethereal body, to the soul that's nourished. So it's like that person never really lived. They're an NPC. Their attention is given over to parasites, which are thought forms, subtle forms in consciousness that have varying levels of vibration depending on how they relate to reality. So when there's a big disconnect between the conditioned self and the reality, those vibrations go lower. They cry out for alignment, to bend reality to what they want to be. But when there's no idea about the way things should be, when attention is given over to the expression of divine will in this moment, then one becomes love itself, or one realizes that that's what they were all along. Jesus talked about his food as being the will of the Father, and that his food is doing the will of the Father. And it can be the same for you in the alignment of attention with the divine expression in this moment, in dying unto oneself, that self being the non-self that's mistaken for self in the ignorance of body identification. So attention is not given to the false, but rather the true. And that is a transformation, and that is the cultivation of the soul. So the light of the truth grows the soul from the spiritual heart, the soul being the jiva, the ethereal body. And yet this thing is not what you are to the extent that you are what observes it, though it determines whether or not you suffer. So, yes, there are NPCs, but it's not necessarily permanent. People can move away from being an NPC into being conscious. It's unusual. It often requires less than an ideal life, a life that contradicts the ideal that's held in mind, bringing a suffering that calls for relief and an investigation of suffering's source. If that relief is sought in simply bending the world to the mind's ideal, then there'll be no insight gained. But if that suffering motivates a search for the truth, a search for the cause of suffering, then it's possible. Then it can bring a shift. It's a change in the default placement of attention to one that brings this life in abundance. And in that, there's the perception of the love that just pours out over the world in perpetuity. It's there to be perceived, if only attention can be yielded from obsessive thinking. That's all for now.